All right, so next panel coming up. I also want to point out we're over halfway begun with our TEDx talks and another bunch. There's a way you can go in, and if you go on TED.com right now, on the homepage, it's just featured a TEDx Boston talk, and probably within a month that'll get 1 million views. And we're at 250 million views for TEDx Boston. We're the most of any TEDx, and all these Web3 talks we think are going to go viral and become like the Thomas Jefferson Library of Congress founding kind of thoughts on Web3 on TED. I'm really excited about this next panel. Mike, who we absolutely love working with, the crypto guy from Forbes, we asked him, in terms of all the people we have, who would, if you could, do an I Dream a Genie, snap your fingers, wiggle your nose, who would you want to interview? And this is what we got. So Mike, thank you for curating this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, our next panel.
Thank you so much for that too kind introduction. I think if you look at where we just came from with the previous panel, building on top of blockchain, we kind of want to strip a layer off top that and take a look deeper at the infrastructure. This whole idea of building on the shoulders of giants, those giants are being created today and will be the future leaders of the space. If you go back to Web 1, I think that you could arguably say that was owned in the early days in UCLA in the 60s, and it had literally decades to evolve organically, and people were discovering the need and the demand. Web 2, arguably owned by Stanford, and it had sort of a decade, a little more than a decade, to evolve organically to what it is today. I think Web 3 is being planned. It is in fact still evolving, but it's evolving at an incredibly fast rate. And there's a much clearer vision of what needs to exist today for Web 3 than I think we ever had in the early days of Web 1 and Web 2. So I wanted to kind of get the ball started here by really bringing some clarity at the level 0, level 1 position here, where the very basis of blockchain, distributed ledger technology, or any other technology that you might see fit. What needs to exist today that does not already exist in order for all these great things that we're talking about being built on top of blockchain to occur?
Oh wow, how many hours do we have? Well, the most obvious thing that needs to exist is MIT needs to build a satellite campus in Silicon Valley. Just to make it easier for, of course, as many people as possible to interact with just the amazing minds here and all the great ideas. But in terms of blockchain, if you think about what Satoshi did, which is to solve the trustless transaction ordering problem and timestamping problem, he really solved it for a special case. And the special case was that everyone is using the same system, the same blockchain. And in that case, he or she solved the double spend problem. But of course, what has happened is that people don't just use one blockchain, they use many blockchains. And that, as a trend, certainly will only continue. So the unsolved problem on a very fundamental technical level is, how do you solve the double spend problem in a situation where people are interacting with hundreds of blockchains? And that's basically the sort of higher dimensional case of what was solved in the original Bitcoin paper.
So I think fundamentally, if you look at the evolution of blockchain technology to this point, there are a bunch of minimum requirements that need to be consistently present for people to feel comfortable deploying traditional businesses on top of it. We've talked about the blockchain trilemma. If you look at those minimum requirements, they're sort of inconsistently met, that scalability, decentralization, and security, and you see different performance from different chains. All chains have slightly different architectures. They all have pluses and minuses to them, but ultimately everyone's striving to build something that can become a new sort of infrastructure for financial exchange that gives the same confidence that one would have if you were using a traditional system or a traditional method. And if you do that, you remove all sorts of friction, you unlock all sorts of barriers to participation for people who have trouble with the existing infrastructure. And until you beat that minimum requirement, and the product you offer at least meets and hopefully exceeds the end user expectation, you're never going to see mass adoption really kick in. If you size the entire market today isn't even the complete, the total value of Apple. So we're still got a long way to go, and I think that until the industry can sort of uniformly rally around those performance issues so that traditional businesses start to enter confidently, I think that's probably the single biggest barrier is that consistency.
I agree with that. So we need to make it easier to use for normal people, I think. And having some standardization, I think, is what you alluded to. But from a user perspective, you think about it right now, there's really bifurcated usage. There's the crypto native people who are very comfortable for waiting, and playing with MetaMask. And then there are the normal people. If they are involved, they're actually using like a Coinbase wallet that is a little bit closer to that of their Schwab wallet, if you will. What needs to happen is better UI, UX, so that more normal, traditional people can have the same similar experience you see on Schwab in a MetaMask type environment. So we need, everyone here is very good at the underlying, basically engineering, creating functionality. I'm not saying functionality is perfect, it's got to get better, but you almost need to move up the stack and start thinking about product. And product people think about usability. So we need better UI, UX, and that's a very important thing that I think before we can get mass adoption.
Definitely, I agree. UX is super important. I'll talk about more specific things. So I would say like, first for decentralization and Web3, the whole stack needs to be decentralized. That includes your domain names, for example. .com is completely centralized and so on. Even hosting right now is centralized. So all of that stack needs to be decentralized, but that's a technical solvable problem. One high-level thing I would say people need to differentiate or learn is that Web3 is not about forced decentralization. It's about having the choice to be decentralized. Not every single user needs to use the fully decentralized tech. It just should be possible for anyone who is technically savvy enough to use that decentralized tech. You just simply can't have that buttery smooth user experience in a completely fully decentralized environment. I think we'll soon have like custodial based wallets rather than MetaMask type wallets, so that people can just easily do whatever they want in a completely Web2 experience. They log in with their Google account, they press 2 buttons and it's done. They don't have to worry about any private keys, they don't have to worry about any mnemonics or how to secure them. So I think like that is what will bring mass adoption, but at the same time, MetaMask type wallets should always be available for the technical people who want to use a decentralized tech, who can use a decentralized tech.
The whole idea that decentralization is an asset, that decentralization is a good thing, is I think something that we kind of all assume to be true, many of us at least in this room. Though not everybody does. In fact, there's been some early outspoken internet pioneers, look at folks at the Internet Hall of Fame that have said, my internet doesn't need your blockchain. And in fact, there's a little bit of truth to that in the sense that in the early days, that there was a brief period of time after it was created in the halls of UCLA and percolated around where it was legitimately decentralized for a very brief period. The act of centralization happened over time. And there have also been some of these early internet pioneers that have expressed regrets about some of the design decisions that they made in those early days, that if they had gone left instead of right, or gone right instead of left, the internet that we have today would not have centralized as much as it is. And I can't help but wonder, like, are we facing a situation right now in the early days of Web3 where there are decisions being made where if we turn right, it's going to eventually re-centralize again? Or are there processes that can be put in place, technologies that can be built that assure with certainty that there will not be centralization at some point in the future?
That's really an amazing question. That's incredibly important for us to wrap our heads around. So there's one obvious thing to point out simply from a CS perspective, which is that any decentralized technology is always going to be slower, more cumbersome, more expensive, harder to compute on. And so right out of the gates, if you build a truly decentralized system, you're going to be at a chronic disadvantage compared to a centralized solution. And that's just a basic fact of life. And so that means when, of course, like a UI is important, but we know full well that regardless of what we do in terms of the tech stack, we're always going to pay a price in terms of speed, complexity, reliability, and all this stuff because the system is decentralized. That's almost like a law of nature. And so then the question is, how do we convince humans who are going to use the technology that they should pay a price in terms of convenience and cost to get the benefits of a decentralized technology? It breaks my heart when I ask audiences, like, raise your hand if you care about privacy. Generally, like, everyone, raises their hand, of course. And then I say, well, if I give you a free piece of pizza, will you tell me everything about yourself? And they're like, of course, I get a free piece of pizza. And so the real question is, like, how much pain are people going to want to go through to deal with the decentralized technology compared to something that's always going to be more convenient, less expensive, faster, which is centralized?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
That's a good point. I mean, I remember reading a stat where it was done by NBC and Wall Street Journal. This was like in 2019. 60% of their Facebook users that this survey took did not trust Facebook with their information. But at the same time, today there's 3 billion people who use Facebook. That's more than the 1.7 billion people that's actually banked. So I think right now there's just no alternative because you're so used to the efficiencies. And now you just use it because you can't give it up anymore.
I think I have a slightly different perspective. I think that I think ultimately, if we do this right, that the vast majority of people in the world will have no idea they're using a blockchain, and they're just using applications, and they'll get the benefits of it. There are many chains out there that are performant enough that the average person would have absolutely no idea they're on a blockchain. The fees on, if you're not Ethereum, for example, the fees are, very reasonable across the board and actually drive inclusivity by removing barriers for people to actually just get access to basic banking and interest rates. I think that there's a real benefit to that, and it doesn't surprise me that the people who are centralized right now are walking around saying that, boy, this is a great thing. I mean, because they hold all the power. And I think if you really think about decentralization and start from a place that says there doesn't need to be a central authority, but the crowd through, the architecture of the blockchain, or a DAO, which might have the ability to drive its own governance in certain economic environments, is vastly superior. And I think we're rapidly approaching a point where people aren't going to have to make the trade-off. They're not even going to know they're using a decentralized system because the performance is going to be there for them.
Yeah, definitely. I think we need to just focus on the strengths of blockchain. There are certain things that blockchains can do that not decentralized systems still can't do. One example that comes to mind is settling securities trades. For example, in most states or countries, it's still T+2. If you do a trade, it happens 2 days later. On the blockchain, you can settle anything instantly. You can do an instant trade without trusting any centralized party, and it can't be reversed. So those kind of strengths that blockchains have, I think we just need to focus on those. We don't need the whole world to start using blockchains or become decentralized. There are like some use cases for which it will make sense, but if we try to push everything on a decentralized network, then again we'll struggle with scalability and user experience. So yeah, we just need to focus our efforts.
Sean, you talked about in the future there's a possible world where we don't even know we're using blockchains. Devil's advocate, we have a world today where the people who do know they're using blockchains are frequently opting not to actually participate as much as we would like. I'm talking about some of the early governance models that have been put in place where centralized software was turned over to a group of decentralized users who were given the right to vote and to decide the future of these protocols, and it's like a 5% turnout rate. Like the stakeholders are not participating. Is this a solvable problem, or is it an inherent sort of lack of interest in participating in our own future here?
Well, I mean, my quick response to that is that if you look, it depends on what you think a blockchain is ultimately. And if you think about a blockchain as essentially you're trying to build a country from scratch, go down that path and say that the blockchain itself is the infrastructure in the country. The people that come to build are new people that are trying to build new businesses. There's economic policy, there's monetary policy, there's all the components of a country except it's built in a sort of a technical environment. And I think a lot of countries were tried and failed. A lot of monetary policy and economic policy has been tried and failed. I think that we're, I would just come back to say we're early days. From my experience, we're in like 2001 maybe from the internet perspective, and there was a lot of fits and starts and experimentation. So the thing that you're pointing to is potentially a sign of an issue, to me is an absolute verification in experimentation and technical advancement that's trying to find a foothold by pushing one another to get there.
So would you guys say that lack of participation at that very basic level is in fact a technical problem? Is it something that can be coded out of existence or fixed by code, or is it lack of education? What is it that needs to be corrected in order for these theoretically very powerful governance models to actually be used?
Yeah, I can add a little of that in that. So I think there are two aspects to this. One is an awareness issue. People just don't realize there is voting going on in these DAOs and so on. So that is a big issue. Now, being decentralized, there is no single way to reach out to everyone. You can't throw pamphlets everywhere. You don't have the budgets of these big political parties to do campaigns and so on. So that is one problem. Hopefully, it will get solved eventually. And the second issue is just around incentives and incentive alignment. Most of the people don't see any benefit of voting. This is true in general democracy as well, but it gets more visible in the blockchain world, because the reality is the most of the DAOs, I won't say all, but most of them just are not decentralized enough, and there is like 2 or 3 parties that control majority stake, either the foundation that created it or the early investors, name anyone. 2 or 3 parties can sway the vote in any direction. So that just doesn't give confidence to the users that their vote means anything. Over time, I think as we decentralize, this will change, so it will get better, but it will take time.
I agree with what Mudit just said. Part of the problem why people don't take advantage of the governance on blockchains is because they've been psychologically trained to think that their voting just doesn't matter that much. And until you realize that you can vote easily and it does matter and it counts, you won't. I'll give you examples. We all probably have stock accounts at various brokerage houses. How many times do you get an email about a proxy vote for something and they want your vote? And how many times do you actually take the time to go and vote and have your opinion heard? Or our respective universities. There's always like new board of trustees and people are going to be anointed and they ask you for your opinion. And it takes time to learn who these people are or what exactly the proxy vote was. So therefore, you're just like, well, I don't have time to do it. And by the way, whatever my vote is, I bet you it doesn't really matter because there's a group of people who will figure it out for me, so they don't vote. So the fact that it's not happening on DAOs and in the blockchain space, I think it's just a general human psychological thing right now. Once it becomes easier to do and they see that the vote counts in a blockchain environment, they will actually change their habits and actually start doing it.
In the early days of Bitcoin, there were some mining pools that accidentally approached 51%. And there was some very panicked articles written about what this would mean for the industry, that in the self-interest of all of these individuals who wanted to get rich off their Bitcoin mining, they were going to pool their resources and accidentally give a central authority the ability to break Bitcoin. And in every instance that I know of, the mining pools that accidentally approached that 51% mark willingly broke themselves up, willingly handed over power, willingly divided themselves up and created firewalls between the different groups and ensured that there wasn't an accidental 51% attack. You could argue that it would be very, very difficult, maybe impossible for that to happen now, but in the early days, that was something that scared a lot of people. I'm seeing something similar happening now. Some of the technology that we're talking about that needs to exist, some of the foundational infrastructure that needs to exist, is actually already funded. It just hasn't been built yet. And it's funded by VCs that in exchange for their investment have obtained a decent purse of coins. And one could argue that the act of re-centralization has already started to happen in the fact that these VCs own so many tokens. If Bitcoin was arguably saved by these Bitcoin mining pools voluntarily handing over their power in order to restrict themselves from having a 51% attack vector, like, do you think that VCs might potentially be undermining their own investment by having so much voting power, by having so many tokens, that the very promise of Web3 starts to evaporate before it even exists?
Well, I mean, VCs frequently undermine their own investments, so that wouldn't be the first time. But yeah, that's a fascinating question. Well, the good news is that we're dealing with people who like to go across the grain a little bit around the world, and this is all open source. And so it's hard to imagine, even if there's one super well-funded company that's supposedly solving X, Y, and Z, I find it very hard to imagine that there won't be 3 or 4 or 5 others who are trying to do better and something more interesting. So just based on the heterogeneity and robustness of the open source coding ecosystem, I would imagine that that threat is relatively low.
Yeah, just like mining pools don't want 51% power, I don't think any VC would want it, because although it gives you power, it gives you legal liability as well. Someone can make a case against you that you control the network basically. So I don't think any VC would ever want to have that. But yeah, that's true. Like all VCs, even in the traditional world, they want, if they see a good company, they want as big of a chunk as they can get. In the traditional world, you have rules and laws regulating it. You have to make disclosures and so on. It's not regulated as much in the Web3 world, but eventually it will be.
I think the good news here is a lot of the VCs in the crypto space are already starting to self-enforce.
Yeah.
And they do not want to be X% of the drop or of the equity. So again, respectful to all the VCs here, they are moving in the right direction, although there have been times, obviously, where if they own X% in the pool, they're kind of like centralizing it.
Sean, anything you want to add?
Well, I just think part of it too is the risks of centralization are often very closely correlated with the way that blockchain is architected and the way the governance and voting actually works. There's ways to mitigate it with the technology, but I mean, you know, I agree with my esteemed panelists here that the you know, general concept of selflessness does exist on some level.
John, you kind of were dancing around this idea of the role that human nature plays in a lot of this. And in some of our earlier conversations, we've had a chance to get into a little bit of that. Is the movement towards centralization an inherent part of who we are as humans? Can it be fixed with code? Should it be fixed with code? Is it a problem at all in the first place? I'd love to kind of just wrap things up here with a conversation about human nature and the role that it is playing in the creation of this code that could eventually power the future of not only our financial system, but much, much more.
That's very deep. I don't even know where to begin with that. We should start with the professor. But I do believe that human nature, human psychology does change over time. And I think when you give them choices, like Mudit shared earlier, and you have choices that are better, you can have a better result. A lot of what human nature ends up doing is what's convenient, what's available right now. So I think it's all of our jobs on this panel here to continue to build this alternative platform so that everyone does have a choice, and then human nature can actually gravitate to what makes more sense for everyone.
Yeah, on that, I can maybe add a little. So with human nature, I think trying to fight is stupid. It's it will only change over time. Slowly, you can nudge it in a direction, but if you just build something completely opposite to what human nature is, people just won't use it. Convenience is a big factor, and that reminds me of like this Netflix era and piracy era. So Netflix picked up so much because it was convenient. People were happy to pay for convenience, and now if you look in the recent times, Netflix is not doing so great, and that's mainly because Netflix is no longer convenient. There are like 10 different streaming platforms. Nobody has all of the content, so people are again finding piracy to be more convenient, and unfortunately moving in that direction. So yeah, if you just have to work with human nature rather than fight it.
I would add on this, though, that there's sort of the ugly side of human nature if we're talking about sort of greed, right? And that's the side of it. And I think there is a way to decode that, meaning that, there was a project that we worked with, a company, a business that was in Nigeria, and they decided to take payments and institute payments on our blockchain. And after the first paycheck, let's call it, all the employees thought there'd been a mistake made because everyone received a 30% raise. And it's because of the fact that no one was skimming off the top of the payroll anymore. So there's a way to sort of reorient our thinking of human nature where we shouldn't have to give up our personal information and our privacy to get access to limited value, but give enormous value to centralized authorities, for example, like Facebook. And so at the end of the day, what you can do with blockchain is people can earn based on their information. They can participate without barriers caused by these central authorities, and they can eliminate a number of the sort of centralized fraudulent mechanisms that exist in the economy today to the benefit of more people.
And on a historical note, of course, the security of Bitcoin fundamentally arises from the greed of the miners, because they'd be silly if they, did funny stuff, because they'd lose all their money gradually. And so, of course, the like absolutely beautiful thing about Bitcoin is that it like harnesses human greed to create a decentralized, secure system, which is totally fascinating.
Had a conversation a couple days ago with Gavin Wood, the co-founder of Ethereum and Polkadot and a couple other things. And he was describing what he called the princes of Web 2.5. And the idea of the princes of Web 2.5 is these are entrepreneurs who are masquerading as Web3 leaders who are actually secretly building infrastructure that is centralized and control that they have. The risk being that if enough of these princes of Web 2.5 take control, the world might not know they're not actually using genuinely decentralized infrastructure. We might not ever actually make it to Web3. This idea that we might all be using blockchain and never actually know that we're using blockchain sort of introduces this possibility here. Are you concerned that the princes of Web 2.5 might actually be undermining the future of Web 3? And if so, which princes of Web 2.5 are you most afraid of?
Who are these Web?
I was hoping you were going to say a name.
Kaiser Soze's of Web 2.5. I mean, look, you don't have to get me going on a conspiracy theory, so I'm happy to do that, but I don't spend a lot of time worrying about that.
No, I'll just add, like, if someone is scared of Web 2.5 princesses, they are not making the right thing. Web 3 is gonna be better than 2.5.
Thank you guys so much. Please give them a round of applause.
So you never know who's in the room. Come here. So he's going to pitch in a minute as a startup, but he's a fractional billionaire. Here, can you tell what you did? So you did something interesting in Web 2, and now you're trying to figure out Web 3 and autonomous cars and stuff. But what was your background?
So I was the first Chinese American immigrant to be a nuclear submarine officer before I came here to MIT.
The Chinese Navy or with the U.S. Navy?
No, this is with the U.S. Navy, and I have now 2 sons in the Naval Academy. And but I came.
That's not how he became a fractional billionaire. And was Jimmy Carter around your?
No, he was much. He was a nucauclear submarine officer.
Secret handshake, nuclear?
No.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I missed that one. But I did come to MIT to get a couple of master's degrees. Caught the entrepreneurial bug in Web 1, When 99, I started a security software company that I'm currently on my 5th and 6th startup. And my previous 4 were all fortunately acquired by large publicly traded companies, and the last one being LuPay that became Samsung Pay. And prior to that was a Web2 point of sale that called Roam Data that ended up supplying to everybody that was competing against Square at the time. So I'm going to give a little talk over there at, I think, 420 or something like that.
So he's going to pitch his company, but I just want you to know, we have some kids that just graduated from college, some kids that just dropped out of MIT to start a thing, and then you got these guys that are nuclear submarine drivers that ran Samsung's Pay stuff that could be on an island retiring. So we got them all. Thank you. Good luck with your pitch.